The woman in the wheelchair never said thank you, until the morning she whispered his name. For 3 months, Ethan Cole had helped her cross the street every dawn, believing he was doing something good, something that made him feel human again after years of barely surviving as a single father. But when she finally spoke, when she said thank you, Ethan, without him ever telling her who he was, everything inside him went cold. Because there are only two kinds of people who know your name without asking: friends you've made or ghosts you've created. If you want to see how one act of kindness unraveled into a reckoning 8 years in the making, stay until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., same as always. Ethan Cole's hand shot out from under the thin comforter, silencing the phone before the sound could wake Lily. His daughter needed every minute of sleep she could get. 7th grade was hard enough without a father who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford the field trip to the science museum. He lay there in the dark for 30 seconds, listening to the radiator clank and hiss in the corner of their studio apartment. The building was old, the kind where you could hear your neighbors' arguments through the walls and smell whatever they cooked for dinner. But the rent was $890 a month, utilities included, and that was as close to a miracle as Ethan believed in anymore. He swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting the cold linoleum, and moved through his morning routine in the dark. Splash water on face, brush teeth, pull on the same black pants and white button-down shirt he wore to his shift at Morrison's Pharmacy. The shirt was getting thin at the elbows, but it was clean, and that counted for something. By 5:15, he was out the door. The November air hit him like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. Boston didn't ease you into winter. It arrived all at once, turning the streets gray and the wind bitter. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, a thin windbreaker that did almost nothing against the cold, and started the 15-minute walk to work. The city was still half asleep at this hour. A few early commuters hurried toward the T station, heads down, earbuds in. A delivery truck rumbled past, its exhaust creating small clouds in the frigid air. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded. Ethan had walked this route so many times he could do it with his eyes closed. Down Berkshire Street, left on Columbus, straight through the intersection at Hammond. It was at Hammond Street, right in front of the closed bakery with the faded awning, that he first saw her. The woman in the wheelchair. That had been 3 months ago, early September, when the mornings were still warm and the leaves hadn't started turning. She'd been sitting at the corner facing the crosswalk, her hands folded in her lap. The light was red, and she was just waiting. Ethan had noticed her particularly because she was so still. Most people waiting to cross a street had some kind of movement to them, checking their phones, shifting their weight, looking around. But this woman sat perfectly motionless, her face tilted slightly downward, dark hair falling forward to partially obscure her features. He'd stopped a few feet away, waiting for the light to change. And that's when he noticed the wheelchair's front wheels were caught in a crack in the sidewalk, stuck at an angle that would make it difficult for her to move forward when the light turned green. "Excuse me," he'd said, keeping his voice gentle. "Your wheel's caught. Mind if I help?" She hadn't responded, hadn't even looked at him. For a moment, Ethan thought maybe she hadn't heard him, or maybe she was deaf. But then she gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, just a slight dip of her chin. He'd stepped forward, gripped the wheelchair's handles, and lifted slightly, freeing the wheels from the crack. The light turned green. Without thinking much about it, Ethan pushed her across the street, matching his pace to the pedestrian signal's countdown. On the other side, he'd stepped back. "There you go. Have a good morning." She still didn't speak, didn't turn around, just continued forward, rolling away down the sidewalk until she disappeared around the corner. Ethan thought that would be the end of it. But the next morning, she was there again. Same spot, same time, same posture. Hands folded, head slightly bowed, wheels positioned as if waiting for assistance. He'd helped her again. And the morning after that, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, it had become routine. By the end of the first month, it was habit. By month 3, it was the only part of Ethan's morning that felt like it mattered. Because here was the thing about Ethan Cole's life. It had become very small. There had been a time, years ago, before Lily, before everything fell apart, when his life had felt expansive, full of possibility. He'd been enrolled at UMass Boston, studying business administration, working part-time at a sporting goods store, dating a woman named Michelle, who laughed at his jokes and talked about the future like it was a place they'd both get to see. Then Michelle got pregnant. They tried to make it work, moved in together, talked about marriage, made plans that felt real for about 6 months. But Michelle had dreams that didn't include a baby or a boyfriend who was suddenly working 40 hours a week at a pharmacy instead of finishing his degree. She'd left 2 weeks after Lily was born, and Ethan hadn't heard from her since. He didn't blame her. Not really. Sometimes he imagined what his life would have looked like if he'd been the one to leave, and the fantasy was so seductive, so full of freedom and possibility, that it scared him. But he'd stayed. And staying had meant dropping out of school. It meant working at Morrison's Pharmacy for $16.50 an hour, picking up weekend shifts at a warehouse in Quincy for another $15. It meant learning to cook dinner for under $5, becoming an expert in thrift store shopping, and discovering exactly how much pride you could swallow before it stopped hurting. His world had contracted to a series of small, repeating loops: apartment to pharmacy to warehouse to apartment, Lily's school to parent-teacher conferences to Lily's school, grocery store every Sunday, laundromat every other Wednesday, church basement food pantry once a month when things got really tight. There wasn't room in that life for heroism or grand gestures. There was only the grinding work of survival, which is why helping the woman in the wheelchair felt important. It was small, yes, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was something kind, something decent. It made him feel for 60 seconds each morning like he was still a person who helped other people, like he hadn't been entirely worn down to nothing. Lily noticed, of course. Lily noticed everything. "You're late again," she'd said one morning about 6 weeks into the routine, looking up from her cereal as Ethan hurried through the door at 3:45 p.m., 15 minutes past when he usually got home from his pharmacy shift. "Sorry, sweetheart, the bus was running behind." "The bus is always running behind." Lily tilted her head, studying him with those sharp, observant eyes that sometimes made Ethan wonder if his 12-year-old daughter was actually 40. "But you're specifically late by the same amount every day." Ethan hung up his jacket, buying time. "What are you, keeping a log?" "I notice patterns." She pushed her glasses up her nose. Frames held together with electrical tape after a mishap at school last month. New glasses cost $200 they didn't have. "You help someone, don't you?" He shouldn't have been surprised. Lily was scary smart, the kind of kid who read 3 grades above her level and did her math homework in pen because she never made mistakes. "There's a woman," he admitted, sitting down across from her at their small kitchen table. "She's in a wheelchair. I help her cross the street in the mornings." Lily's expression didn't change. "Every morning?" "Yeah, every morning." "For how long?" "Couple months now." "Does she ask you to help?" "No, but she needs it." Lily ate another spoonful of cereal, chewing thoughtfully. "Does she say thank you?" Ethan paused. In all these weeks, probably 60, 70 times now that he'd helped this woman, she had never once spoken to him, never turned around, never acknowledged him beyond that first small nod. "No," he said. "She doesn't really talk." Lily's tone was neutral, but there was something in it that made Ethan defensive. "Some people have trouble with social interaction," he said. "Maybe she's anxious, or maybe there's something else going on. It doesn't matter. She needs help. I help her. It's simple." "Simple," Lily echoed. She stood up, carrying her bowl to the sink. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Does she look grateful?" The question landed strange. Ethan thought about it, really thought about it, and realized he didn't know. He'd never seen the woman's face clearly. She always had her head tilted down, hair falling forward, and he was always behind her, pushing the wheelchair. "I don't know, Ab," he admitted. Lily rinsed her bowl, dried her hands, and turned around. "You should pay attention." Then she'd gone to her corner of the studio, a space they'd sectioned off with a bookshelf and a tension rod with a curtain, to do her homework, leaving Ethan sitting alone at the table wondering what exactly his daughter was trying to tell him. But the next morning, and the morning after that, he'd help the woman anyway. Because what else was he supposed to do? Stop helping someone who needed help just because they didn't perform gratitude for him? That felt petty. Wrong. the kind of thinking that led to a smaller, meaner world. So he kept going, kept showing up at 5:30 a.m., kept finding her there at the Hammond Street corner, kept pushing her across in silence. Until the morning, everything changed. It was a Thursday, mid-November, cold enough that Ethan's breath came out in visible puffs, but not yet cold enough for snow. He approached the corner, and there she was, same as always. Hands folded, head down, wheelchair positioned just so. "Morning," he said quietly, stepping behind the chair. The light turned green. He pushed her forward, his hands finding their familiar grip on the rubber handles. They crossed in silence, the wheelchair's mechanisms making soft clicking sounds against the pavement. They reached the other side. Ethan stepped back, ready to continue his walk to the pharmacy. And that's when she spoke. "Thank you, Ethan." Her voice was soft but clear. 3 words, calm and deliberate. Ethan froze, his hand still resting on the wheelchair's handle. His entire body went cold. She'd said his name. His name. He stood there, not breathing, not moving, as she wheeled herself forward down the sidewalk without looking back. Within seconds, she had turned the corner and disappeared from view. Ethan's mind raced, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd worn his name tag from work by accident? He patted his chest. No, the name tag was in his pocket where it always was during his commute. Maybe she'd overheard someone call him by name? But who? There was never anyone else around at this hour. Maybe. No. There was no maybe. He had never told her his name. He was certain of it. Absolutely certain. And yet she knew it. The rest of Ethan's day passed in a blur. He went through the motions at Morrison's, stocking shelves, running the register, consulting with Mr. Morrison about inventory orders. But his mind was elsewhere, circling around and around those 3 words. "Thank you, Ethan." How did she know? By the time his shift ended at 3:30, he'd constructed and demolished a dozen theories. Maybe she'd looked him up somehow, but how? He hadn't given her any information. Maybe she'd followed him home one day and seen his name on the mailbox. But their building didn't have names on the mailboxes, just apartment numbers. Maybe she'd asked someone in the neighborhood, but who would know him well enough to give out his name? None of it made sense. When he got home, Lily was already there, sitting at the table with her homework spread out in front of her. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "What happened?" Ethan hung up his jacket, trying to appear casual. "What do you mean?" "You look like you saw a ghost." He sat down across from her, rubbing his hands over his face. For a moment he considered not telling her, but Lily had a way of extracting information. She'd find out eventually, and it would be worse if he tried to hide it. "The woman I help in the mornings," he said slowly. "She spoke to me today." Lily put down her pencil. "What did she say?" "She said, 'Thank you.'" He paused. "And she said my name." His daughter's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a sharpening of focus. "You never told her your name?" "No." "You're sure?" "Completely sure." Lily was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in a pattern that meant she was thinking. Finally, she said, "Dad, have you ever actually looked at her? Like, at her face?" Ethan thought about it. "Not really. She always has her head down. For 3 months you've been helping this woman, and you've never seen her face. I'm behind her when I push the wheelchair, and when I'm not, she's looking down," Lily finished. "Which is weird, don't you think? Most people would at least glance at someone helping them." "Maybe she's shy." "Maybe." Lily's tone suggested she thought otherwise. "Or maybe she doesn't want you to recognize her." The word sent a chill through Ethan. "Recognize her from where?" "I don't know, but people don't usually hide their faces from strangers. They hide them from people they know." She leaned forward. "Dad, when's the last time you really thought about everyone you know? Not just now, but before. Before I was born. Before you worked at the pharmacy." Ethan's stomach tightened. There were parts of his past he didn't think about, couldn't afford to think about. "Lily, that was over a decade ago." "So?" "So I barely remember those years. I was a different person." "Were you a good person?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Lily's face was serious, her eyes searching his. Ethan started, then stopped. "What kind of question is that?" An important one. She gathered her homework into a neat pile. Because if this woman knows your name, and you don't know how, that means something. And if she's been letting you help her every single day for months without saying anything, that means something too. It doesn't mean anything bad, Ethan said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. Maybe she's just... Dad? Lily's voice was gentle but firm. You taught me to trust my instincts. My instincts say something is wrong. That night, after Lily had gone to bed behind her curtain, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee going cold in front of him. The apartment was quiet except for the ever-present hiss of the radiator and the distant sound of traffic on Columbus Avenue. He thought about what Lily had said, about being a good person, about the past. The truth was, there were years of his life he'd intentionally pushed away, buried under the weight of daily survival. After Michelle left, after he became a single father at 23, there'd been no time for reflection or regret, only the immediate demands of feeding a baby, finding work, keeping a roof overhead. But before that, before Lily, before responsibility, there had been a different Ethan. Younger, stupider, more careless with his choices. He got up and went to the small closet by the front door, reaching up to the top shelf where he kept a cardboard box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants of his old life, a UMass student ID with a photo of him looking impossibly young, ticket stubs from concerts he could barely remember, a few birthday cards from his mother before she'd died, and a manila folder containing documents he'd shoved in there and tried to forget. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out the folder. Inside were papers from his early 20s, tax returns from his sporting goods store job, a lease agreement for an apartment in Alston he'd shared with 2 roommates, a traffic ticket from 2015, and underneath all of that, a police report. Ethan stared at it, his heart beginning to pound. He remembered this, had spent 8 years trying not to remember it. The report was dated March 17, 2017, a traffic accident on Route 93, just outside the city. Ethan had been a witness, one of several people who'd been driving nearby when a silver Honda Civic had been struck by a commercial truck that ran a red light. He remembered stopping, remembered the sound of twisted metal and car alarms, remembered giving his statement to the police officer who'd taken his information. What he remembered less clearly, what he'd worked very hard to forget, were the details that came after. A week later, a man had shown up at his apartment. Mid-40s, expensive suit, lawyer's card that identified him as representing Allied Interstate Trucking. The man had been polite, friendly even. He'd explained that the accident was complicated, that there were questions about who was at fault, that witness statements would be crucial. And then he'd offered Ethan money. Just to clarify a few things in your statement, the man had said, sliding an envelope across the kitchen table. Make sure the timeline is accurate. You might have been confused about the traffic light. It was late. You were tired. These things happen. Ethan had been 24 years old. He'd been working 40-hour weeks and taking night classes, trying to finish his degree while living in a shitty apartment and eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week. His checking account had $127 in it. The envelope contained $3,000 in cash. He'd told himself it wasn't really lying. He'd told himself he genuinely might have been confused about the light, that maybe it had been yellow instead of red, that his memory wasn't perfect. He told himself that $3,000 could pay for 2 months of rent and the medical bill from when he'd sprained his ankle and gone to urgent care without insurance. He'd taken the money. He'd called the lawyer back and clarified his statement, changed a few words, adjusted the timeline, made it sound like maybe, possibly, the Honda Civic could have been at fault instead of the truck, and then he'd shoved the whole thing into a box and tried never to think about it again. Now, sitting in his dark apartment 8 years later, Ethan forced himself to read through the police report. There were 3 other witnesses listed. He scanned their names, trying to remember if any of them had seemed familiar. And then he saw it. Under victim information, driver of the Honda Civic, Clara Vaughn, age 24. Occupation, dancer. Injuries. Severe spinal trauma, compound fractures to both legs, internal bleeding. Ethan's hands went numb. He got up, went to the kitchen counter where he'd left his phone, and did something he should have done months ago. He searched for Clara Vaughn. The first result was a news article from March 2017. Local dancer's career cut short by tragic accident. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and a radiant smile, posed mid-leap in a dance studio. The article explained that Clara Vaughn had been a rising talent in Boston's contemporary dance scene, performing with a prestigious company and teaching classes on the side. The accident had left her with permanent spinal damage and the loss of mobility in both legs. The second result was a legal filing from 2018, Vaughn v. Allied Interstate Trucking Settlement Agreement. Ethan clicked on it with shaking hands. The document was dense with legal language, but the essential facts were clear. Clara had sued the trucking company for damages. The case had initially looked strong, but witness testimony, specifically conflicting accounts about the traffic signal, had complicated her claim. The settlement she eventually received was a fraction of what her lawyers had initially sought. Ethan felt sick. His clarification had done that. His $3,000 had helped a corporation deny a young woman the compensation she deserved for an accident that destroyed her career and her body. He sat there for a long time, the phone screen going dark in his hand, trying to breathe. Clara Vaughn, the woman in the wheelchair he'd been helping every morning for 3 months. She knew exactly who he was, and she'd been waiting. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Why had Clara been at that corner every morning? What did she want? Was she planning to confront him, expose him, call the police? Worse, did she deserve to? The answer to that last question was obviously yes. Of course she deserved to. He'd taken money to lie. He'd helped a corporation escape responsibility for ruining someone's life. The fact that he'd been young and broke and stupid didn't change what he'd done. But what was he supposed to do now? Go to her? Apologize? Try to explain that he'd been a different person back then? That he'd made a terrible choice he'd regretted ever since? Except he hadn't regretted it. Not really. He'd forgotten about it. Buried it. Let himself off the hook by pretending it had never happened. At 4:47 a.m., the alarm went off. Ethan silenced it and lay there in the dark, trying to decide what to do. He could skip the corner, take a different route to work, avoid Clara entirely and pretend this revelation had never happened. But that was the coward's choice, and whatever else he was, however many mistakes he'd made, Ethan didn't want to be a coward. Not in front of Lily. Not in front of himself. He got up, got dressed, and headed out into the cold November morning. His legs felt heavy as he walked down Berkshire Street. With every step, he thought about turning back. But he kept going, left on Columbus, straight toward Hammond. As he approached the corner, he saw her there. Same position, same posture. But this time, when he got close enough, she lifted her head. And for the first time in 3 months, Ethan saw Clara Vaughn's face clearly. She was older than in the photo, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 8 years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing sharp cheekbones and a gaze that was steady, unwavering, and completely aware. She'd been beautiful once, in motion. Now there was something else in her face, something harder, something that had been forged in the kind of pain Ethan couldn't imagine. "Hello, Ethan," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We should talk." The words hung in the frigid morning air between them, and Ethan felt his throat close up. The street was empty except for the two of them and the distant rumble of an early delivery truck several blocks away. A gust of wind swept down Hammond Street, carrying the smell of exhaust and something baking from the closed bakery behind them. "I don't," Ethan started, but his voice came out strangled. He cleared his throat. "I don't understand." Clara's expression didn't change. "Yes, you do." She was right. He did understand. He just didn't want to admit it. "How long have you known?" he asked. The question felt stupid the moment it left his mouth. She'd known from the beginning. Of course she had. "Since the first morning you helped me." Clara's hands remained folded in her lap, her posture almost relaxed. "I recognized you immediately." "But I didn't—" Ethan stopped himself. "My face. I must look different now." "You do. Older, tired." Her eyes traveled over him, clinical and assessing. "But I've spent 8 years remembering everyone connected to that accident. I know the lawyer who convinced you to change your statement, I know the insurance adjuster who used your revised testimony to cut my settlement in half. I know the judge who accepted the settlement over my lawyer's objections. And I know you, Ethan Cole. I know your face better than you probably know it yourself." The words were delivered without anger, which somehow made them worse. Ethan felt his legs weaken. "Then why did you let me help you? Why didn't you say something?" "Because I wanted to see what you would do." Clara tilted her head slightly. "I wanted to know if you felt guilty, if you remembered, if there was any recognition in your eyes when you looked at me." "There wasn't," Ethan said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "No, there wasn't." She paused. "You helped me every single morning for 3 months, and you never once showed any sign that you knew who I was, which means either you're an excellent actor or you genuinely didn't remember ruining my life." The accusation sat between them like a physical object. Ethan wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd been young and desperate, that he'd made a terrible mistake he couldn't take back. But what came out instead was the truth. "I remembered the accident," he said. I didn't remember you." Something flickered across Clara's face then. Not anger, but something colder. Disappointment, maybe. Or confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "Of course you didn't," she said softly. "Why would you? I was just a stranger in a car, a transaction worth $3,000. Ethan flinched. "How did you know the amount?" "I didn't until just now." Clara's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "But there's always an amount, isn't there? People don't compromise their integrity for free. They just price it differently." A car passed behind them, its headlights sweeping across the intersection before disappearing down Columbus. The sky was starting to lighten, not sunrise yet, but the deep black of night fading into charcoal gray. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked. His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Clara considered the question. "What do you think I want?" "I don't know. Money? An apology?" He ran his hand through his hair, agitated. "To press charges? To ruin my life the way I helped ruin yours? Would any of that change what happened?" "No." "Then why would I want it?" Clara shifted in her wheelchair, adjusting her position slightly. "Ethan, I didn't orchestrate this situation because I want revenge. I'm not interested in destroying you." "Then what are you interested in?" "The truth." She met his eyes directly. "I wanted to know if you were a fundamentally bad person who took that money because you didn't care about the consequences, or if you were a weak person who made a terrible choice and then buried it because looking at it hurt too much." Ethan felt the assessment cut through him. "And which one am I?" "I don't know yet," Clara said. "That's why we're talking." The light turned green, then red again. Neither of them moved. Ethan became aware of the cold seeping through his thin jacket, of his hands shaking, from the temperature or from adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "I was 24, he said finally. "I was working full-time and taking night classes, trying to finish a degree I couldn't afford. I had $127 in my checking account, and then this lawyer showed up at my apartment with an envelope full of cash and told me I might have been confused about what I saw that night." "Were you confused?" "No." The admission came out flat, factual. "I saw exactly what happened. The truck ran the red light. The driver was on his phone. I told the police officer all of that in my initial statement." Clara nodded slowly. "But then you changed it." "I told myself it was possible I'd been wrong, that maybe I'd misremembered, that maybe the stress of the accident had distorted my perception." Ethan's voice was quiet now, almost a whisper. "I convinced myself that $3,000 wasn't really the price of lying. It was just compensation for correcting the record." "And did you believe that?" Ethan thought about the question, really thought about it. "At the time, maybe. Or maybe I just needed to believe it because the alternative was admitting I was selling out a stranger for rent money." "And after?" Clara pressed. "In the years since? Did you think about it?" This was the part that made Ethan sick with shame. "No, I didn't think about it at all. I took the money, paid my rent, finished the semester. 6 months later, my girlfriend got pregnant and my whole life changed, and I just let myself forget. I shoved those papers in a box and pretended it never happened. Until last night." "How did you—" Ethan started, then stopped. Of course she knew. She'd been watching him for 3 months. She'd probably seen the change in his face this morning, the evidence of a sleepless night. "You went home and looked me up," Claire said. It wasn't a question. "Found the news articles, the lawsuit, realized who I was and what your testimony cost me." "Yes." "And how did that feel?" The question was delivered without malice, but Ethan heard the weight behind it. Clara wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was asking because his answer mattered. "Like I wanted to throw up," he said honestly. "Like I'd discovered I'd killed someone and just forgotten about it." "You didn't kill me," Claire's voice was measured. "But you did make my life significantly harder. The settlement I received, the one your revised testimony helped reduce, was supposed to cover my medical expenses, rehabilitation, housing modifications, and lost income from my dancing career. Instead, it covered about 18 months of medical bills and nothing else." Ethan closed his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" The question was sharp now, cutting. "Are you sorry you did it, or are you sorry you got caught?" His eyes snapped open. "Both. I'm sorry for both. I've been standing here trying to figure out how to explain that I was desperate and stupid and I made a choice I can't take back, but the truth is there's no explanation that makes it okay. I traded your future for $3,000 and then I forgot about you entirely. That's not something apologies fix." Clara studied him for a long moment. The sky continued to lighten behind her, the streetlights starting to look pale and unnecessary against the coming dawn. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly. The question caught Ethan off guard. Yes, a daughter. She's 12. "What's her name?" "Lily." "Does Lily know what you did?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Not until last night. She asked me about you, about the woman I was helping. She had questions about why you never spoke, why you never looked at me. And then when you said my name yesterday, I couldn't keep it from her." "What did you tell her?" "The truth." The words came out rough. "I told her I'd been a witness to an accident 8 years ago, and that I'd taken money to change my statement. I told her that the person in the accident was you, and that my lie had cost you compensation you deserved." How did she react? Ethan remembered Lily's face last night, the shock, the disappointment, the way she'd looked at him like she was seeing a stranger. She was devastated. She asked me if I was a bad person. I didn't know how to answer her. "What did you say?" "I said I'd made a very bad choice, and that I was still trying to figure out what that meant about who I was." Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. "That's a better answer than most people would give." "It doesn't change anything." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't. But it tells me something about you now versus who you were then." A man in a business suit hurried past them, heading toward the tea station, too focused on his phone to notice the two people having an intense conversation at the corner. His footsteps faded into the distance. "Why did you wait 3 months?" Ethan asked. "You could have confronted me the first morning, or the second. Why wait until now?" Claire's expression became distant, like she was looking at something far away. "Because I needed to know if you were worth confronting. If you'd shown any recognition, any guilt, any awareness of what you'd done, if I'd seen that in your face even once during those 3 months, I would have said something immediately. But you didn't. You just helped me cross the street every morning with this expression of quiet nobility, like you were performing some act of charity." Ethan felt the observation hit home. That's exactly what he'd been doing, wasn't it? Using Clara's perceived helplessness to make himself feel better about his own small, struggling life. "I'm sorry," he said again, knowing the words were inadequate. "Stop apologizing," Clara said, not unkindly. "Apologies are easy. They're what people say when they want to feel better about something they did without actually fixing it." "Then what do you want me to do?" Clara's eyes locked onto his. "I want you to tell the truth." The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan felt his stomach drop. "You mean—" "I mean exactly what I said. I want you to go to the lawyers who handled my case. I want you to give them a sworn statement recanting your altered testimony. I want you to tell them exactly what happened, that you were paid to lie, that your original statement was accurate, that Allied Interstate Trucking's driver was at fault. That could—" Ethan's mind raced through the implications. That could reopen your lawsuit, but it would also mean admitting to perjury. I could go to jail. Yes, Clara said simply. You could. The air between them felt charged, electric. Ethan thought about Lily, about what would happen to her if he went to prison. Who would take care of her? Where would she live? His brother was overseas, his father had been out of the picture for years, and Michelle, Lily's mother, hadn't been heard from in over a decade. If I do this, he said slowly, my daughter loses her father. If you don't do this, Claire replied, your daughter grows up knowing her father chose to protect himself instead of doing what was right. The words cut deeper than any anger could have, because Clara was right. Lily had asked him last night if he was a bad person, and he hadn't known how to answer. But the real question, the one that mattered, was whether he was going to keep being the person who took money to lie, or whether he was going to become someone different. I need time, Ethan said. I need to think about this. I need to talk to my daughter. Clara nodded. I thought you might say that, which is why I'm going to give you 1 week. 1 week? 7 days. That's how long you have to decide whether you're going to do the right thing or whether you're going to keep running from what you did. She reached into a bag hanging from her wheelchair and pulled out a business card. This is my lawyer's information. If you decide to come forward, call him. He'll know what to do. Ethan took the card with numb fingers. The name embossed on it read David Chen, attorney at law, with a phone number and an address in downtown Boston. And if I don't call? He asked quietly. Clara's expression hardened. Then I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. I have copies of both witness statements, your original one and the revised version. I have the lawyer's notes documenting that you were paid. I have bank records showing the deposit. If you won't tell the truth voluntarily, I'll make sure it comes out anyway. That's blackmail. No, Clara said calmly. Blackmail is when you threaten to reveal someone's secrets unless they pay you. I don't want your money, Ethan. I don't want anything from you except honesty. What I'm offering is a choice. You can control this narrative by coming forward yourself, or you can wait for me to control it for you. Ethan felt trapped, cornered, but underneath the panic there was something else, something that felt almost like relief, because the secret was out now. The thing he'd buried for 8 years was exposed, and there was no shoving it back into the box. Why are you giving me a choice at all? He asked. If you have all that evidence, you could just go to the lawyers yourself. Blow this whole thing open without ever talking to me. Clara's face softened slightly. Because I've spent 8 years living with the consequences of your choice, and I've learned something in that time. Forcing someone to do the right thing isn't the same as them choosing to do it. If I drag you into this kicking and screaming, it doesn't actually fix anything. You'll just be a victim in your own story, someone who got caught instead of someone who stood up. She paused, then added, but if you choose to come forward, if you decide on your own that you'd rather face the consequences than keep hiding, then maybe something actually changes. Maybe you become a different person than the one who took that money. And maybe your daughter gets to see what it looks like when someone makes a terrible mistake and then has the courage to make it right. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back. You're giving me the chance to be better than I was. I'm giving you the chance to be who you should have been in the first place, Clara corrected. What you do with it is up to you. The light turned green again. This time, Clara wheeled herself forward without waiting for help. She moved across the intersection with practiced efficiency, her arms working the wheels in steady, even strokes. Ethan stood frozen on the curb, watching her go. Just before she reached the other side, she turned back and called out to him. 1 week, Ethan, then I need an answer. She disappeared around the corner, leaving him alone on the empty street with a business card in his hand and a choice that felt impossible. Ethan didn't go to work. He called Morrison's pharmacy from his cell phone, told Mr. Morrison he was sick, and headed home instead. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get his key in the apartment door. Lily was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. She looked up as he came in, her expression wary. You're back early, she said. Ethan hung up his jacket and sat down across from her. I talked to her, to Clara. Lily put down her spoon. What did she say? He told her everything. The 3 months of observation, the revelation, the choice Clara had given him. Lily listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. "If I come forward and admit what I did, I could go to jail. And if that happens, I'd be alone," Lily finished quietly. "Yeah." She pushed her cereal bowl away, the contents mostly uneaten. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you took that money, when you changed your statement, did you think about the person in the car, about what it would mean for them?" Ethan wanted to lie, wanted to tell his daughter that he'd agonized over the decision, that he'd lost sleep thinking about the consequences. But he'd already lied enough. "No," he said. "I thought about myself, about my bills and my rent and my problems. The person in the car was just abstract, someone I didn't know and would never meet." "But she wasn't abstract," Lily said. "She was real. She had a life and a career and a future, and your choice helped take that away from her. I know that now. But you didn't know it then because you didn't think about it." Lily's voice was calm, but there was something steely underneath. "And you didn't think about it because it was easier not to." The observation stung because it was true. Ethan had chosen not to think about the consequences of his actions because thinking about them would have made taking the money harder. "You're right," he admitted. Lily stood up and carried her bowl to the sink. For a moment, Ethan thought she was done with the conversation. But then she turned around and said, "Remember when I was 8 and I stole that candy bar from the corner store?" Ethan remembered. Lily had taken a Snickers bar from the rack by the register, slipped it into her pocket while the clerk wasn't looking. Ethan had caught her eating it on the walk home. "I remember. You made me go back and return it, and apologize, and pay for it with my own allowance money." Lily crossed her arms. "I cried. I was so embarrassed. I didn't want to face the clerk and admit what I'd done. But you did it anyway, because you told me that making mistakes was part of being human, but running from them was a choice. You said that owning up to what you did was the only way to keep being someone you could respect." She paused. "Do you still believe that?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan thought about that afternoon 8 years ago, about the choice between $3,000 and integrity. He thought about every morning since then when he'd pushed Clara across the street, performing kindness while ignorant of the damage he'd caused. And he thought about the man he wanted to be, not the man he'd been at 24, but the man he could choose to become now. "Yes," he said finally. "I still believe that." Lily nodded. "Then I think you know what you have to do." "It's not that simple. If I go to jail—" "Dad," Lily's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm 12 years old. I'm not a baby. I know what could happen if you tell the truth. But I also know what happens if you don't." "What's that?" "I grew up knowing that when things got hard, when you had to choose between doing the right thing and protecting yourself, you chose yourself. And every time I look at you, I'll wonder if you'd make that same choice again. If when it really mattered, you'd choose me over doing what was right." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut, because Lily was articulating something he hadn't even fully processed himself, that his choice now would define their relationship for the rest of her life. "I don't want you to be alone," he said quietly. "I don't want that either," Lily replied. "But I'd rather be alone temporarily than spend the rest of my life with a father who taught me that integrity only matters when it's convenient." Ethan felt something break open inside his chest. His daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, was braver and clearer about right and wrong than he'd been at 24. Than he'd been at 32, for that matter. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, his voice rough. "I had a good teacher," Lily said. "At least I did before last night." The words stung, but they were fair. Ethan had spent 12 years teaching his daughter about responsibility, honesty, and standing up for what was right. And then she'd discovered that he'd failed to live up to those standards himself. "I can fix this," he said. "I can be that teacher again." "I know you can." Lily came back to the table and sat down across from him. "But you have to actually do it, not just talk about it." Ethan looked at his daughter's face. Serious, determined, holding him accountable in a way that most adults wouldn't. And he realized that this was the moment that would define the rest of their lives together. Not the mistake he'd made 8 years ago, but the choice he made now, with full knowledge of the consequences. "I'm going to call the lawyer," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth about what happened, and I'm going to face whatever comes after." Lily's expression didn't change, but something eased in her shoulders. "Okay. But we need to make plans, in case things go badly. We need to figure out where you'll stay, who'll take care of you if I can't." "We'll figure it out," Lily said. "But Dad?" "Yeah." "Thank you for choosing the right thing." Ethan felt tears burn in his eyes. He reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here." "Better late than never," Lily said softly. They sat there together as the morning sun finally broke over the buildings outside, streaming through their small window and filling the kitchen with pale yellow light. Ethan thought about Clara, about the 8 years she'd spent rebuilding a life after her future had been stolen. He thought about the $3,000 that had seemed so important at the time, and how little it meant compared to what it had cost. And he thought about the phone call he needed to make. "I should do this now," he said, pulling out the business card Clara had given him, "before I lose my nerve." Lily squeezed his hand. "I'll be right here." Ethan picked up his phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times before someone answered. "David Chen's office." "Hi," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he expected. "My name is Ethan Cole. I need to speak with Mr. Chen about a case involving Clara Vaughn. I have information about witness testimony that was compromised." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can you hold, please?" "Yes." The line went to hold music, something classical and oddly soothing. Ethan looked at Lily, who gave him an encouraging nod. 30 seconds later, a man's voice came on the line. "This is David Chen. Am I speaking with Ethan Cole?" "Yes, sir." "And you're calling about the Vaughn case? The Allied Interstate trucking accident from 2017? "Yes. I was a witness. I gave testimony that—" Ethan's throat tightened. "That wasn't truthful, and I'd like to correct the record." Another pause, longer this time. When Chen spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Mr. Cole, are you aware that what you're describing could have serious legal implications for you personally?" "Yes, sir, I am." "And you still want to proceed?" Ethan looked at his daughter, at her clear, honest eyes. "Yes, I do." "All right," Chen said. "I think we need to meet in person. Are you available this afternoon?" "I'll make myself available." "Good. Come to my office at 2 o'clock. The address is on the card Ms. Vaughn gave you. And Mr. Cole?" "Yes?" "You're doing the right thing." The words should have felt reassuring, but they just made Ethan more aware of how wrong everything that had come before had been. "Thank you," he said. "I'll see you at 2. He hung up and sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. It was done. He'd set the wheels in motion. There was no taking it back now. "How do you feel?" Lily asked. Ethan thought about it, terrified, ashamed, uncertain about the future. But underneath all of that, there was something else, something that felt almost like freedom. "Like I can finally breathe," he said. The hours between the phone call and the 2 o'clock appointment stretched out like taffy, each minute feeling both too fast and impossibly slow. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink, watching the clock on the microwave tick forward with mechanical indifference. Lily had gone to school after making him promise, twice, that he would actually go to the meeting and wouldn't talk himself out of it. She'd hugged him at the door, fierce and quick, before heading out into the November morning with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Now the apartment felt too quiet, too empty. Ethan kept running through scenarios in his head, each one worse than the last. What if the lawyer called the police immediately? What if there was a warrant issued before he even left the office? What if he never came home again? He forced himself to get up, to move. He showered and dressed in the only outfit that felt remotely professional, a pair of khaki pants and a button-down shirt he usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences. In the bathroom mirror, he looked pale, older than his 32 years, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of the sleepless night he'd endured. At 1:30, he left the apartment and walked to the T station. The train was half empty, filled with the usual midday crowd of students and shoppers and people whose work schedules didn't follow the traditional 9 to 5. Ethan sat by the window, watching the city slide past, thinking about all the lives being lived in the buildings and streets around him. People who'd never taken money to lie, who'd never compromised someone else's future for their own comfort. Or maybe they had. Maybe everyone carried secrets like his, buried deep and carefully ignored. Maybe the world was full of people who'd made terrible choices and spent the rest of their lives pretending they hadn't. The thought didn't make him feel better. David Chen's office was in a modest building in downtown Boston, sandwiched between a Thai restaurant and a dry cleaner. The lobby was small but clean, with vinyl chairs and a reception desk where a woman in her 50s sat typing on a computer. "Ethan Cole," he said. "I have a 2 o'clock appointment." She looked up, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Mr. Chen is expecting you. 3rd floor, suite 304. Ethan took the elevator up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway on the 3rd floor smelled like carpet cleaner and coffee. He found suite 304 and knocked. "Come in," a voice called. David Chen was younger than Ethan expected, maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and wire-rimmed glasses. He stood up from behind a desk covered in file folders and extended his hand. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming." They shook hands. Chen's grip was firm but not aggressive. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and Ethan sat down, feeling like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "No, thank you." Ethan's throat was dry, but he didn't trust himself to hold a cup without his hands shaking. Chen sat down and folded his hands on the desk. "So, you called this morning saying you had information about compromised witness testimony in the Vaughn case. Before we go any further, I need to be clear about something. I'm Clara Vaughn's attorney. Anything you tell me, I'm obligated to use in her best interest. Do you understand that?" "Yes." "And you still want to proceed?" Ethan thought about Lily's face that morning, the way she'd looked at him with something like hope. "Yes." Chen pulled out a legal pad and uncapped a pen. "All right. Tell me what happened." So Ethan told him. He started with the night of the accident, March 17th, 2017, driving home from his shift at the sporting goods store, seeing the crash happen right in front of him on Route 93. He described giving his initial statement to the police, clearly stating that the commercial truck had run the red light while the driver was distracted by his phone. Then he told Chen about the lawyer who'd shown up at his apartment a week later, the envelope with $3,000 in cash, the suggestion that Ethan might have been confused about the traffic light, that maybe it had been yellow instead of red, that witness memories weren't always reliable under stress. "Did he explicitly tell you to lie?" Chen asked, his pen moving across the legal pad. "Not in those words. He said I should clarify my statement to ensure accuracy." But we both knew what he meant. Ethan's voice was quiet. "And I knew what I was doing when I called back and changed my testimony." Chen made a note. "Did you sign anything? Any kind of agreement or contract?" "No, it was just cash and a handshake." "Did anyone witness this transaction?" "No, it was just the two of us in my apartment." Chen tapped his pen against the pad, thinking. "The lawyer's name, do you remember it?" Ethan closed his eyes, reaching back through 8 years of memory. Robert something. Robert Mitchell, maybe. "He gave me a business card, but I threw it away." "Robert Mitchell," Chen repeated, writing it down. "That's useful. He was Allied Interstate's primary counsel on this case." He looked up. "Mr. Cole, I have to ask, what changed? Why are you coming forward now after all this time?" Ethan had been expecting this question, but he still wasn't sure how to answer it. "Clara found me. She's been watching me for 3 months, letting me help her cross the street every morning, and then yesterday she said my name. She told me she knew what I'd done." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "She confronted you?" "Not exactly. She gave me a choice. I could come forward voluntarily or she'd expose what I did on her own." Ethan paused. "But that's not really why I'm here." I'm here because my daughter asked me if I was a bad person, and I didn't know how to answer her. I'm here because I've spent 8 years pretending I didn't destroy someone's life, and I can't do it anymore." The lawyer studied him for a long moment. "You understand that by admitting this, you're confessing to a crime? Witness tampering, potentially perjury, depending on how the revised statement was formalized. You could face criminal charges." "I know." "You could go to prison." "I know that too." Chen leaned back in his chair. "Most people in your position would hire a lawyer before making any statements, would claim they were coerced or confused, would fight this every step of the way." "I'm not most people," Ethan said. "Then, more honestly, or maybe I am, and I'm just tired of being that person." Something shifted in Chen's expression. Not quite approval, but a kind of acknowledgement. "All right, here's what happens next. I'm going to prepare a sworn affidavit based on what you've told me today. You'll review it, and if everything is accurate, you'll sign it in front of a notary. Once that's done, I'll file a motion to reopen Clara's case based on newly discovered evidence, specifically your recantation of the altered testimony. How long will that take?" "The affidavit? A few days. The motion itself could take weeks or months to be heard, depending on the court's schedule. And there's no guarantee it will be successful. The original settlement was finalized years ago, but your statement gives us grounds to argue that the settlement was obtained through fraudulent means." Ethan nodded slowly. "And what about the criminal charges?" "That's harder to predict. The district attorney's office will have to decide whether to prosecute. It's possible they won't. The crime happened 8 years ago. You're coming forward voluntarily, and there might not be enough physical evidence to build a strong case." Chen paused. "But it's also possible they will prosecute. You need to be prepared for that." The reality of it settled over Ethan like a weight. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was his life, potentially unraveling in real time. "Do you want to reconsider?" Chen asked. "I can give you more time to think about this. To consult with your own attorney." Ethan thought about it, about Lily, about the apartment they could barely afford, about the fragile stability of their life together, about all the ways this could go wrong. Then he thought about Clara's face that morning, about the 8 years she'd spent in a wheelchair because a truck driver had been on his phone, and because Ethan had been willing to lie for money. "No," he said. "I don't need more time. I want to do this." Chen nodded and pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. "This is Clara's case file. I'm going to go through some details with you to make sure your recollection aligns with the existing evidence. It's going to take a while, probably 2 or 3 hours. Are you okay with that?" "I'm okay with that." For the next 3 hours, Ethan answered questions. What time had the accident occurred? What was the weather like? Where exactly had he been positioned on the road? What had he seen in the moments before impact? Chen cross-referenced everything Ethan said against the police report, the accident reconstruction, and the testimony of other witnesses. It was exhausting. Ethan found himself reliving that night in vivid detail. The screech of tires, the sound of metal crumpling, the way the Honda Civic had spun across 2 lanes before coming to rest against the median barrier. He'd been 24 years old, driving home after a 10-hour shift, and he'd seen a woman's life change in an instant. And then he'd helped the people responsible escape accountability. By the time Chen finally put down his pen, it was almost 5:30. The light outside the office window had faded to the deep blue of early evening. "That's everything I need for now," Chen said. "I'll draft the affidavit and have it ready by Friday. Can you come back then to review and sign it?" "Yes." Ethan stood up, his legs stiff from sitting so long. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How is Clara? I mean, beyond the physical stuff. Is she okay?" Chen considered the question. "She's resilient, stronger than most people would be in her situation. But the accident took a lot from her. Her dance career, obviously, her financial security, her sense of safety in the world." He paused. The hardest part wasn't the physical injuries. It was the knowledge that the system failed her, that people lied and got away with it, and there was nothing she could do about it. Ethan felt the words like a knife between his ribs. "I was one of those people." "Yes," Chen said simply, "you were. But you're also the only one who's trying to make it right." The observation didn't make Ethan feel better, but it gave him something to hold on to as he left the office and stepped back out into the cold November evening. He took the T home, watching the city lights blur past the train windows. Commuters packed in around him, people heading home from work, heading out to dinner, living their normal lives. Ethan wondered how many of them were carrying secrets like his. How many had made choices they couldn't take back. When he got home, Lily was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her. She looked up as he came in, her eyes searching his face. How did it go? Ethan hung up his jacket and sat down across from her. I told him everything. He's drafting an affidavit for me to sign on Friday. And then what? And then he files a motion to reopen Clara's case, and we wait to see what happens. Lily closed her textbook. Are you scared? Terrified, Ethan admitted, but also relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for 8 years, and I can finally exhale. His daughter reached across the table and took his hand. I'm proud of you, Dad. The words broke something open in Ethan's chest. He squeezed her hand, not trusting himself to speak. They sat there together as darkness settled over the city outside. After a while, Lily started talking about her day at school, a quiz in social studies, a conflict with a friend at lunch, a funny thing her science teacher had said. Normal, everyday things that felt precious precisely because they were normal. Ethan listened and responded and tried to memorize this moment, this feeling of sitting with his daughter in their small apartment, both of them knowing that everything was about to change but choosing to be present anyway. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the dark and thought about Clara. He wondered what she was doing right now, whether she knew he'd gone to see her lawyer, whether she felt any satisfaction in knowing he was finally facing the consequences of what he'd done. He wondered if she'd ever be able to forgive him. He wondered if he deserved forgiveness. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Ethan went to work at the pharmacy, restocking shelves and helping customers, all while knowing that his life was a ticking clock counting down to Friday. He didn't see Clara at the usual corner. Either she'd stopped coming or she was taking a different route. He wasn't sure which possibility bothered him more. Lily watched him carefully, asking how he was feeling, making sure he was eating enough. At 12 years old, she'd somehow become the parent in their relationship, and Ethan felt both grateful for her presence and guilty that she had to shoulder this burden. On Thursday night, Mr. Morrison asked Ethan to stay late to help with inventory. They were in the back room counting boxes of bandages and over-the-counter medications when Morrison cleared his throat. You've seemed distracted this week, he said. Everything okay at home? Ethan considered lying, then decided he'd done enough of that for one lifetime. Not really. I'm dealing with some legal issues from a long time ago. Morrison looked up from his clipboard. He was in his 60s, had owned the pharmacy for 30 years, and had the kind of face that had seen enough of life not to be easily shocked. Anything I should know about? I'm going to be signing a legal statement tomorrow, admitting to something I did 8 years ago. It might lead to criminal charges. The older man set down his clipboard. Is this something that affects your job here? I don't know yet, but I wanted you to know in case I need to take time off, or if things go badly and I can't come back at all. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Is this the right thing to do? Signing this statement? Yes, Ethan said without hesitation. Then do it. And don't worry about the job. We'll figure it out. The simple acceptance in Morrison's voice made Ethan's throat tight. Thank you. We all make mistakes, Ethan. What matters is what we do about them. Morrison picked up his clipboard again. Now help me count these aspirin bottles before we're both here until midnight. Friday arrived cold and bright. Ethan called in sick to work again. Morrison had given him a knowing look when he'd mentioned needing Friday off, and told him to take whatever time he needed. Lily had wanted to skip school to come with him, but Ethan had convinced her to go, promising to text her as soon as it was done. He arrived at Chen's office at 10 in the morning. The receptionist ushered him straight back, and he found Chen waiting with a stack of documents. I've prepared the affidavit, Chen said, gesturing to the papers. Read through it carefully, make sure everything is accurate. If you want to change anything, now's the time. Ethan sat down and began to read. The document was written in formal legal language, but the facts were all there. His original truthful testimony, The visit from Robert Mitchell, the cash payment of $3,000, his decision to alter his statement, and the specific ways he had changed his account of the accident. Reading it felt like looking at an X-ray of his own moral failure. Every sentence was a reminder of the choice he'd made, the person he'd been. But it was also the truth, laid out cleanly and completely, with nowhere left to hide. "It's accurate," he said finally. "All of it." Chen called in a notary, a woman in a gray suit who asked Ethan to raise his right hand and swear that the statement was true to the best of his knowledge. Ethan did, his voice steady despite the way his hands shook. He signed the affidavit in 3 places. The notary added her seal and signature. And just like that, it was done. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "Now I file the motion with the court," Chen said. "I'll also send copies to the district attorney's office and to Allied Interstate's legal team. You should expect that things will start moving fairly quickly after that." "How quickly?" "Could be days, could be weeks. The DA will need to decide whether to pursue charges. Allied Interstate will likely try to fight the motion. And Clara—" He paused. "Clara will need to decide if she wants to pursue a new lawsuit or if she wants to settle." Ethan nodded. None of this was in his control anymore. He'd done the only thing he could do, which was tell the truth. "One more thing," Chen said. "Clara wanted me to give you this if you went through with signing the affidavit." He handed Ethan an envelope, plain white, with Ethan's name written on the front in careful handwriting. Ethan stared at it. "What is it?" "I don't know. She didn't tell me." Chen stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Cole. I know it wasn't easy." They shook hands, and Ethan left the office with the envelope tucked into his jacket pocket. He didn't open it until he was outside, standing on the sidewalk in the cold November air. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "Ethan, I didn't know if you would do this. I hoped you would, but I've learned not to trust hope too much. The fact that you're reading this means you chose truth over comfort, which is harder than most people realize. I can't forgive you yet. Maybe I never will. But I can acknowledge that you're trying to be better than you were. That counts for something. Thank you for giving me the chance to rebuild what was taken. Clara." Ethan read the note 3 times, standing there on the busy Boston street while people hurried past him. The words weren't absolving him. Clara had made that clear. But they weren't condemning him either. They were simply honest. He folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope, then pulled out his phone and texted Lily. "It's done. I signed it. Coming home now." Her response came back almost immediately. "I'm proud of you." Ethan stood there for a moment longer, looking up at the gray November sky. He thought about the chain of events that had led him here. The accident 8 years ago, the choice to take the money, the 3 months of helping Clara cross the street, the revelation, and finally this moment of accountability. He thought about what came next, the investigation, the possible charges, the uncertainty of his future. He thought about Lily and how they would manage if he went to prison. He thought about Clara and whether his confession would actually help her get the compensation she deserved. And then he started walking home, because that was all he could do. Put one foot in front of the other and face whatever came next. The weekend passed quietly. Ethan and Lily stayed in the apartment, watching movies and cooking simple meals and not talking much about the affidavit or what it might mean. It felt like they were both holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. On Monday morning, Ethan was getting ready for work when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it with his heart in his throat. "Mr. Cole, this is Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. I need to speak with you about a legal matter. Are you available to come to my office this afternoon?" Ethan closed his eyes. "Yes. What time?" 2 o'clock, Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, 1 Bullfinch Place. Ask for me at the reception desk." "I'll be there." He hung up and stood there for a moment, phone still in his hand. This was it. The beginning of whatever came next. Lily appeared in the doorway of the bathroom, toothbrush in hand. "Who was that?" "The district attorney's office. They want to see me this afternoon." His daughter's face went pale, but she nodded. "Okay. Do you want me to come with you?" "No, sweetheart. You go to school. I'll text you when I'm done." "Promise?" Promise. She came over and hugged him, fierce and tight. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Ethan held his daughter and tried to believe that was true. At 2 o'clock, he walked into the district attorney's office, his palms sweating despite the cold. The building was imposing, all marble and authority. A receptionist directed him to the 3rd floor, where he found ADA Jennifer Walsh waiting in a small conference room. She was younger than he expected, maybe 35, with red hair pulled back in a bun and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She gestured to a chair. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming. I've reviewed your affidavit regarding the Vaughn case." Ethan sat down. "Okay. I'm going to be direct with you. What you've described in this document, accepting payment to alter witness testimony, constitutes witness tampering under Massachusetts law. It's a serious crime that carries a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison." The number hit Ethan like a physical blow. 10 years. Lily would be 22 by the time he got out. He'd miss her entire adolescence, her high school graduation, her first years of college if she was able to go. Walsh continued, her tone businesslike. "However, there are complicating factors. The incident occurred 8 years ago, which is within the statute of limitations, but barely. You're coming forward voluntarily rather than being caught. And we'd have to prove that you actually received money and that it directly influenced your testimony, which might be difficult given the time that's passed and the lack of physical evidence." Ethan found his voice. "I'm not trying to avoid responsibility. I did what I said I did. I took the money, and I lied." Walsh studied him. "I believe you, but belief and prosecutable evidence are 2 different things." She pulled out a folder. "I've also been reviewing the original case. The lawyer who allegedly paid you, Robert Mitchell, has since been disbarred for unrelated ethics violations. Allied Interstate Trucking has a documented history of pressuring witnesses in accident cases. And your original statement, the truthful one, aligns with the testimony of 2 other witnesses and the accident reconstruction report." "So what does that mean?" "It means I have options." Walsh leaned back in her chair. "I could charge you with witness tampering and take this to trial. We might win, we might not, or I could offer you a deal. You cooperate fully with the investigation into Allied Interstate and Robert Mitchell, you testify if we pursue charges against them, and in exchange, we pursue reduced charges or potentially no charges against you." Ethan's mind raced. "You'd go after them instead of me? They're the bigger fish. Mitchell was a licensed attorney who corrupted the legal process. Allied Interstate has done this multiple times. You're a kid who made a terrible choice when you were desperate." She paused. "Don't misunderstand me. What you did was wrong. But punishing you doesn't necessarily serve justice if it means letting the people who systematically corrupt our legal system go free." "What would I have to do?" "Tell us everything you remember about Mitchell's approach. Help us build a case against him and the company. Be willing to testify in court if it comes to that." Walsh met his eyes. "And accept that this is going to be public. Your name, what you did, all of it. People will know." Ethan thought about Morrison at the pharmacy, about Lily's school, about their neighbors in the apartment building. Everyone would know he'd been the kind of person who took money to lie. There'd be no hiding from it. But then again, hadn't that been the point? To stop hiding? "I'll do it," he said. "Whatever you need." Walsh nodded and pulled out more paperwork. "Then let's get started." They spent 3 hours in that conference room. Walsh asked questions Ethan hadn't thought about in years, pulling details from his memory like a surgeon extracting fragments. What day of the week had Mitchell shown up at his apartment? What time? What exactly had the lawyer said, word for word, if Ethan could remember? Had he mentioned anyone else's name? Had there been any paperwork, even something Ethan hadn't signed? Ethan answered everything as honestly as he could, watching Walsh's assistant take notes on a laptop, while Walsh herself scribbled observations on a legal pad. When they finally finished, it was past 5 o'clock, and Ethan's head was pounding. "That's good for now," Walsh said, closing her folder. "We'll be in touch as the investigation develops. In the meantime, don't leave the state without notifying me, and don't discuss the details of this case with anyone except your attorney, if you decide to get one, which I'd recommend." Ethan stood up, his legs stiff from sitting. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you think Clara will get what she deserves from all of this?" Walsh's expression softened slightly. I think she has a much better chance now than she did before you came forward. Whether that translates into actual compensation depends on a lot of factors outside my control. But you gave her something important. What's that? The truth. Sometimes that matters more than money. Ethan wasn't sure he believed that, but he nodded anyway and left the building, stepping out into the early evening darkness. The temperature had dropped, and his breath came out in white clouds as he walked to the T station. He texted Lily from the train. Done with the DA, heading home. Long story, but I think it's okay. Her response was immediate. Pizza for dinner? You sound like you need pizza. Despite everything, Ethan smiled. Yeah, pizza sounds perfect. When he got home, Lily had already called in an order to the cheap place 2 blocks away that sold slices for $1.50 each. They ate at the kitchen table, and Ethan told her about the meeting with Walsh, about the possibility of cooperating in an investigation rather than facing charges himself. So, you might not go to jail? Lily asked, carefully picking pepperoni off her slice. She'd been trying vegetarianism for a month now, though she occasionally wavered. Maybe not, but nothing's certain yet. And even if I don't face criminal charges, there are other consequences. People will know what I did. It might affect my job, our housing, everything. Lily chewed thoughtfully. Dad, can I tell you something? Always. I've been really angry at you since you told me about the accident, like angrier than I've ever been at anyone. She set down her pizza. But I've also been watching how you're handling it. And I keep thinking about this thing my English teacher said last year about the difference between guilt and shame. Ethan waited. She said guilt is when you feel bad about something you did. Shame is when you feel bad about who you are. And guilt can make you better, but shame just makes you hide. Lily looked at him directly. You could have hidden. You could have just stopped helping Clara and hoped she'd go away. But you didn't. You felt guilty, and you did something about it. That's not nothing. Ethan felt his eyes burn. When did you get so wise? I read a lot, Lily said with a small smile. Then more seriously, I'm still angry, and I'm scared about what might happen, but I'm also really proud of you. Can both things be true? Yeah, sweetheart. Both things can definitely be true. They finished their pizza in companionable silence, and afterward Lily retreated behind her curtain to do homework, while Ethan sat at the table with his phone, staring at it like it might offer answers. He wanted to reach out to Clara, to ask how she was doing, to see if his affidavit had meant anything to her beyond the legal implications. But he didn't have her number, didn't know where she lived, and wasn't sure she'd want to hear from him anyway. The note she'd sent had been carefully neutral, acknowledging his choice without forgiving it. Maybe that was all he deserved. Maybe that was all he'd ever get. The next morning, Tuesday, Ethan went back to work at Morrison's. He arrived 15 minutes early and found Morrison already there, restocking the pharmacy counter. Ethan, the older man said, looking up. How'd things go Friday? Complicated, Ethan admitted, but I did what I needed to do. Morrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. We're short-staffed today. Daniel called in sick. You mind taking the front register while I handle prescriptions? It was a return to normalcy that Ethan hadn't expected to feel so grateful for. He took his position at the register, helping customers buy cold medicine and batteries and magazines, losing himself in the routine of scanning items and making change. Around 10:30, a woman came in that Ethan didn't recognize at first. She was maybe 50, well-dressed in a wool coat, and she stood in the vitamin aisle for several minutes before approaching the counter with a bottle of calcium supplements. As Ethan rang her up, she said quietly, You're Ethan Cole, aren't you? His hand stilled on the register. Yes. I'm Margaret Stokes. I work at the Boston Globe. She pulled out a business card. I'd like to talk to you about the Vaughn case, about your affidavit. Ethan felt his stomach drop. How do you know about that? Court filings are public record. Your name is on the motion to reopen the case. Her expression was professional, but not unkind. This is a significant story, Mr. Cole. Corporate corruption, witness tampering, a woman denied justice for 8 years. People should know about it. I don't want to be in the news, Ethan said. I understand that. But this story is going to come out whether you talk to me or not. The question is whether you want your perspective included. She slid the business card across the counter. Think about it. Call me if you change your mind. She paid for her vitamins and left, and Ethan stood there holding her card, feeling like the world was closing in around him. That night he told Lily about the reporter. Are you going to talk to her? His daughter asked. I don't know. Walsh said this would be public, but I didn't think it would happen this fast. Lily was quiet for a moment, then said, Maybe you should. Why? Because if you don't tell your side, someone else will tell it for you, and they might get it wrong. She looked at him seriously. You made a mistake, but you're also trying to fix it. People should know that part too. Ethan wasn't convinced, but he kept the reporter's card. The story broke 3 days later. Ethan was at work when his phone started buzzing with notifications. Text messages from people he hadn't heard from in years, all asking if he'd seen the Globe article. He waited until his lunch break to actually read it. The headline was stark. Former witness admits to false testimony in 2017. Accident case implicates corporate lawyer in bribery scheme. The article laid out everything. The accident, Claire's injuries, the settlement that was far less than her lawyers had sought, and Ethan's affidavit admitting he'd been paid to change his testimony. It named Robert Mitchell and Allied Interstate Trucking, and it included a statement from David Chen saying that Claire was pursuing legal action to overturn the original settlement. What surprised Ethan was that his name was mentioned but not sensationalized. The article presented him as someone who'd made a serious mistake and was now attempting to correct it, emphasizing the corporate corruption angle more than his individual failure. But it was still his name in print, permanently attached to the words false testimony and bribery. He called Lily during his break. I saw it, she said before he could speak. Some kids at school were talking about it. One of them recognized our last name. Ethan felt sick. Are you okay? Did anyone say anything to you? A couple people asked if I was related to you. I said yes. One girl said her mom works in insurance and that companies do this kind of thing all the time, that you were brave for coming forward. Lily paused. Another kid called you a liar and said you should be in jail. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Don't be. They're both right, aren't they? You did lie, but you are coming forward. Her voice was steady, stronger than it should be for a 12-year-old dealing with this. I can handle it, Dad. The question is whether you can. That afternoon, Morrison called Ethan into the back office. The older man's face was grave, and Ethan braced himself for termination. I saw the article, Morrison said, and I've already had 2 customers ask if you still work here. I understand if you need to let me go, Ethan said quietly. Morrison leaned back against his desk. Why would I do that? Because I'm a liability. Because customers won't trust someone who admitted to lying. Ethan, you lied 8 years ago when you were a desperate kid who made a bad choice. Now you're a man who's trying to make it right, even though it might cost you everything. Morrison crossed his arms. In my experience, that's exactly the kind of person I want working for me. Someone who knows what it means to face consequences. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get messier before it gets better. There will probably be more articles, maybe TV news if the investigation heats up. You need to be prepared for that. I know. Morrison nodded. Then get back to work. We've got inventory to finish before closing. The following week brought more attention than Ethan knew what to do with. 2 other news outlets picked up the story. A local TV station reached out for an interview, which Ethan declined. People in the neighborhood started recognizing him, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed disdain. The hardest part was the online comments on the news articles. Ethan knew he shouldn't read them, but he couldn't help himself. Some people called him a hero for coming forward. Others said he should be in prison regardless of cooperation. A few suggested he was only confessing because he'd been caught, not because he felt genuine remorse. That last accusation stung the most because there was truth in it. He hadn't felt remorse until Clara forced him to remember. He'd buried the guilt so effectively that it took a face-to-face confrontation to unearth it. On Friday night, a week and a half after signing the affidavit, Ethan's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer it, assuming it was another reporter, but something made him pick up. Hello? Ethan, this is David Chen. I wanted to update you on the case. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. Okay. The motion to reopen Clara's lawsuit was granted yesterday. The judge reviewed your affidavit and agreed that there's sufficient evidence of fraudulent conduct to warrant reconsideration of the original settlement. Chen's voice was cautiously optimistic. We're moving forward with a new lawsuit against Allied Interstate Trucking. That's good, Ethan said. That's really good. It is. But there's something else. The district attorney's office has formally opened an investigation into Robert Mitchell and Allied Interstate. They want you to testify before a grand jury next month. The words landed heavy. What does that involve? You'll be asked to recount the same information you've already provided, but under oath and in front of a panel of citizens who will decide whether there's enough evidence to indict Mitchell and potentially others at the company. It's a significant step. Ethan thought about sitting in a room full of strangers, admitting under oath what he'd done, knowing it would become part of the permanent legal record. When do I need to be there? December 15th. I'll send you the details. And Ethan, Chen paused. Clara wanted me to tell you that she appreciates what you're doing. She knows this isn't easy for you. The message was small, just a handful of words relayed through a lawyer, but it meant more to Ethan than he could articulate. Tell her I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need her to know that. I will. After hanging up, Ethan sat alone in the quiet apartment. Lily was at a friend's house for a sleepover, one of the few normal 12-year-old activities she'd been able to maintain despite everything. The silence felt heavy, full of all the choices that had led him to this moment. He thought about the grand jury testimony, about standing up in front of strangers and confessing his failure. He thought about Clara rebuilding her case, fighting for compensation that should have been hers 8 years ago. And he thought about Lily, navigating middle school while her father's mistakes played out in the local news. It would be easy to feel sorry for himself, to focus on everything this was costing him, his privacy, his reputation, possibly his freedom if things went badly. But self-pity felt obscene when he considered what Clara had lost. 8 years of her life, her career, her physical autonomy, all because Ethan had valued $3,000 over truth. The next morning, Ethan did something he'd been avoiding. He went back to Hammond Street, to the corner where he'd helped Clara cross for 3 months. It was Saturday, later than his usual morning commute, and the street was busier with weekend shoppers and people running errands. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, looking at the spot where Clara's wheelchair had always been positioned, and tried to understand what she must have felt watching him approach every day. Had she hoped he would recognize her? Had she wanted him to remember on his own? To show some flicker of awareness? Or had she known from the beginning that he'd forgotten that his act of helping her was just empty performance with no real moral weight behind it? I wondered if you'd come back here. Ethan spun around. Clara was behind him, her wheelchair positioned near the entrance to a coffee shop he hadn't noticed. She must have just come out. There was a paper cup in the holder attached to her chair. I'm sorry, he said reflexively. I didn't mean to. I wasn't stalking you or anything. Ethan, Clara's voice was calm. Breathe. I know you weren't stalking me. This is a public corner. He took a breath, his heart hammering. I saw the news about the motion being granted. Your lawyer told me. I know. He said you called. Clara's expression was unreadable. Why did you come here? Ethan looked around at the intersection, the bakery, the street where so much had unfolded without him understanding any of it. I needed to see it again, to remember what it felt like when I didn't know who you were, when I thought I was just helping someone. And how does it feel now? Like I was lying to myself the whole time. He met her eyes. I told myself I was being kind, that I was doing something good, but really I was just trying to feel better about my own life. You were convenient, someone I could help without it costing me anything real. Clara tilted her head slightly. That's probably true for most charity. People help others because it makes them feel good about themselves. But you weren't charity. You were... Ethan struggled for the right words. You were someone I'd already hurt. Someone whose need I helped create. And I couldn't see that because I'd worked so hard to forget you existed. No, Clara agreed. You couldn't see it. But you can see it now. A woman pushing a stroller walked past them, and they both fell silent until she was out of earshot. The morning was cold but clear, the kind of December day where the sunlight looks bright but has no warmth. I'm testifying before a grand jury next month, Ethan said, about Mitchell and the trucking company. I heard. Claire's fingers drummed against her armrest. Are you scared? Terrified, but also, he searched for the right word. Ready. Like this is something I need to do, even though it scares me. That's good. Fear without action is just paralysis. Fear that moves you forward is courage. Clara paused. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I first saw you that morning 3 months ago, walking down the street like you owned it, like you belonged in the world without any weight on your shoulders, I hated you. The words were delivered matter-of-factly, without heat. I hated that you got to forget while I had to remember every single day. I hated that you were walking and I wasn't. I hated that my life had been destroyed while yours just continued. Ethan felt the words like blows, each one deserved. But then I watched you, Clara continued, day after day, week after week, and I started to see things. The way your jacket was too thin for the weather because you probably couldn't afford a new one. The tiredness in your face that spoke of too many hours working and not enough sleep. The way you'd check your phone anxiously, like you were worried about something you couldn't control. She paused, looking past him at the intersection. I realized you weren't living some carefree life. You were struggling too. Not the same way I was, not even close, but you weren't the villain I'd built up in my head. You were just a person who made a terrible choice and then buried it because facing it was too hard. That doesn't excuse what I did, Ethan said quietly. No, it doesn't, but it made me understand something important. You couldn't fix what you'd done until you remembered doing it, and you couldn't remember until someone forced you to look. Clara met his eyes. That's why I waited. That's why I let you help me all those mornings. I needed to see if there was anything in you worth salvaging, if there was any chance that confronting you might actually lead to something changing. And did it? Is there anything worth salvaging? Clara considered the question for a long moment. I think so. You're here, aren't you? You signed the affidavit. You're cooperating with the investigation. You told your daughter the truth, even though it cost you her respect, at least temporarily. She paused. Those aren't the actions of someone who's fundamentally broken. They're the actions of someone who's trying to become whole. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. I don't know if I can ever make this right. What I took from you, you can't give it back, Clara interrupted. The years I lost, the career I'll never have, the body I used to live in, those are gone. Nothing you do will change that. Her voice was firm, but not cruel. But you can do something almost as important. You can tell the truth. You can help make sure the people who systematically corrupt the system face consequences. And you can teach your daughter what it means to own your mistakes instead of running from them. Is that enough? I don't know, Clara said honestly. Ask me again in a year, or 5 years, or 10. This isn't the kind of thing that resolves neatly. They stood there in silence, two people bound together by a choice Ethan made 8 years ago, and the consequences that had rippled forward through time. Finally, Clara said, I should go. I have a physical therapy appointment. Right, of course. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. Clara, thank you for giving me the chance to do this. You could have just destroyed me, and you would have been justified, but you gave me a choice instead. I gave you the choice you should have made 8 years ago, Clara corrected. What you do with it now is up to you. She wheeled herself away, moving down the sidewalk with steady, practiced motions. Ethan watched her go, this woman whose life he'd helped damage, who had enough grace to give him a path toward redemption, even though she owed him nothing. When she turned the corner and disappeared from view, Ethan stood alone on the corner where so much had changed. The light cycled through green, yellow, red, and back again. People crossed the street, living their lives, unaware of the small drama that had played out in this exact spot over the past 3 months. Ethan pulled out his phone and called the number on Margaret Stokes's business card, the reporter from the Globe. She answered on the second ring. This is Margaret. Ms. Stokes, this is Ethan Cole. You wanted to talk to me about the Vaughn case. I did. Are you ready to give an interview? Ethan thought about Lily's words, that if he didn't tell his story, someone else would tell it for him. He thought about Clara's assessment that he was trying to become whole. And he thought about the grand jury testimony coming up, about standing in front of strangers and owning what he'd done. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready. But I want to do it on my terms. I want to talk about what I did wrong, not just what I'm doing now. I want people to understand the whole story." "That's exactly what I want too," Margaret said. "When can we meet?" They scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop in Cambridge. After hanging up, Ethan stood on the corner for a few more minutes, watching the city move around him. He'd spent 8 years trying to outrun his past. Now he was walking straight toward it, knowing that the path forward required going back through everything he'd tried to forget. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more judgment, more consequences, more moments of shame and regret. But there would also be truth. And maybe, eventually, there would be the possibility of becoming someone his daughter could be proud of again. Someone he could be proud of, too. Ethan took a deep breath of the cold December air and started walking home. The interview with Margaret Stokes took place on a gray Tuesday afternoon in a quiet corner of a Cambridge coffee shop. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a coffee he didn't drink, and sat at a table by the window watching people hurry past in the cold. Margaret appeared exactly on time, carrying a leather bag and a small recording device. She was professional but warm, ordering her own coffee before settling across from him. "Thank you for doing this," she said, pulling out a notebook. "I know it's not easy to talk about." "Nothing about this has been easy," Ethan replied. "But my daughter reminded me that if I don't tell my own story, someone else will tell it for me, and they'll probably get it wrong." Margaret smiled slightly. "Smart daughter. Smarter than her father, that's for sure." They talked for nearly 2 hours. Margaret asked questions that were direct but not cruel, and Ethan answered them as honestly as he knew how. He told her about being 24 and broke, about the envelope of cash, about the choice he'd made and the years he'd spent pretending it hadn't happened. He told her about Clara appearing at the corner, about 3 months of unknowing assistance, about the moment she'd said his name. "What was that like?" Margaret asked. "Hearing her say your name when you'd never told her who you were?" Ethan remembered the cold November morning, the way his entire body had gone numb. "Like the ground opening up beneath me, like discovering that the person you thought you were, the decent guy helping someone in a wheelchair, was built on a foundation of something rotten you'd buried so deep you'd forgotten it existed." Margaret made notes. "And when you realized who she was? When you connected her to the accident?" "I wanted to throw up. I wanted to go back in time and choose differently. But mostly I wanted to understand how I'd let myself forget her so completely." Ethan's voice was quiet. "That was almost worse than the original lie. The fact that I'd taken $3,000 to help destroy someone's future and then just moved on with my life like it didn't matter." The article ran the following Sunday, accompanied by a photo of Ethan that Margaret had taken outside Morrison's pharmacy. The headline read, "The Weight of $3,000. One man's journey from deception to accountability." It was a fair piece, neither condemning nor absolving him. It presented the facts of what he'd done, the context of why he'd done it, and his current attempts to make amends. It included quotes from David Chen about Clara's reopened case and from ADA Walsh about the ongoing investigation into Allied Interstate Trucking. What surprised Ethan most was the final paragraph, which included a quote from Clara herself. "What Ethan did 8 years ago was wrong. What he's doing now doesn't erase that. But it does demonstrate that people can change when they're willing to face the truth about themselves." I hope his story encourages others who've made similar choices to come forward. Ethan read that paragraph 5 times, his coffee going cold in his hand. Clara hadn't forgiven him. She'd been clear about that when they talked, but she was willing to acknowledge his effort, to give him credit for trying to be better than he'd been. It was more than he deserved, less than he wanted, exactly what was appropriate. The days leading up to the grand jury testimony passed in a blur. Ethan met with ADA Walsh twice more to prepare, reviewing his statement and anticipated questions. She coached him on how to answer clearly and directly, how to admit wrongdoing without making excuses, how to provide the specific details the grand jury would need to understand the scope of Allied Interstate's corruption. "Remember," Walsh told him during their final prep session, "you're not on trial here. The grand jury is investigating Mitchell and the company, not you. But you need to be completely honest about your own culpability. Any hint that you're minimizing what you did will undermine your credibility as a witness." "I understand," Ethan said. And he did. The only way through this was complete transparency, even when it hurt. December 15th arrived cold and snowy. Ethan wore his one good suit, purchased years ago for a job interview he hadn't gotten, and took the T to the courthouse downtown. Lily had wanted to come with him, but he'd convinced her to stay in school, promising to text her as soon as it was over. The grand jury room was smaller than he'd expected, just 23 citizens sitting in tiered rows like a classroom. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of Boston's population. Ethan sat at a small table facing them, acutely aware of every eye on him. Ada Walsh stood to the side, ready to guide the questioning but letting the grand jurors take the lead. A woman in her 40s sitting in the front row was selected as the foreperson. She introduced herself as Patricia and explained the process. "Mr. Cole, we're here to determine whether there's sufficient evidence to indict Robert Mitchell and Allied Interstate Trucking on charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. You've been called as a witness because you have direct knowledge of their conduct. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Please raise your right hand." Patricia administered the oath, and Ethan swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The weight of those words settled over him like a physical presence. For the next 90 minutes, Ethan answered questions. The grand jurors wanted details: what Mitchell had looked like, what he'd said verbatim, how the money had been delivered, what Ethan had been told to change in his statement. They asked about his financial situation at the time, about whether he'd understood he was doing something illegal, about whether Mitchell had mentioned other witnesses. Ethan answered everything as clearly as he could, even when the questions made him confront aspects of his choice he'd rather not examine. Yes, he'd known it was wrong. No, Mitchell hadn't explicitly threatened him, but the implicit pressure had been there. The suggestion that Ethan's memory might be faulty, the hint that cooperating would be in everyone's best interest. Yes, he'd spent the money immediately on rent and bills. No, he'd never tried to return it or come forward on his own. A younger man in the back row asked, "If Ms. Vaughn hadn't confronted you, would you ever have admitted what you'd done?" It was the question Ethan had asked himself 100 times. "Honestly, I don't know. I'd like to think I would have, that my conscience would have caught up with me eventually, but the truth is I'd done a very effective job of burying what happened. If Clara hadn't forced me to remember, I might have gone the rest of my life without facing it." "So you're only here because you got caught," the man said. "In a sense, yes. But I'm also here because when I was caught, I had to make a choice. I could have denied everything, lawyered up, tried to protect myself. Instead, I chose to tell the truth, even knowing it might cost me everything. I can't claim moral high ground for that. I gave up the right to moral high ground 8 years ago, but I can claim that I'm trying to do better than I did then." The grand juror nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. Walsh stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, did Robert Mitchell or anyone else from Allied Interstate Trucking ever suggest that other witnesses had been similarly compensated?" Ethan thought back to that conversation in his apartment. Mitchell said something about ensuring consistency in witness testimony. At the time, I took it to mean he was just talking to all the witnesses to confirm details. But looking back, the phrasing suggests he was coordinating a broader effort to shape the narrative. "Did he mention any names?" "No, but he seemed very confident that the case would be resolved in Allied Interstate's favor, like he knew something I didn't." Walsh made a note. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." The questioning continued for another half hour, with grand jurors asking follow-up questions and seeking clarification on specific points. Finally, Patricia thanked him for his testimony and excused him from the room. Ethan stood on shaking legs and walked out into the hallway, where Walsh was waiting. "You did well," she said. "Your testimony was clear and credible. The grand jury will deliberate now, but I'd be surprised if they don't return an indictment." "What happens if they do?" "Then Mitchell and potentially several executives at Allied Interstate will be charged with witness tampering and obstruction of justice. There will be a trial, and you'll be called to testify again, but that's months away if it happens at all. For now, you're done." Ethan nodded, feeling exhausted and hollowed out. "Thank you for preparing me." "Thank you for coming forward," Walsh replied. "Not enough people do." Outside the courthouse, snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. Ethan stood on the steps for a moment, tilting his face up to the sky, letting the cold sting his skin. He pulled out his phone and texted Lily. "Finished? On my way home." Her response came immediately. "Proud of you, Dad. Pizza again tonight?" Ethan smiled despite his exhaustion. "You read my mind." The grand jury returned an indictment 3 days later. The news broke on a Friday afternoon. Robert Mitchell and 2 executives at Allied Interstate Trucking were being charged with multiple counts of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and fraud. The investigation had uncovered evidence of a systematic effort to manipulate witness testimony in at least 4 separate accident cases over a 6-year period. Ethan's name appeared in the articles, identified as the witness whose recantation had triggered the investigation. Some of the coverage was sympathetic, presenting him as someone who'd been taken advantage of by a corrupt system. Other coverage was more critical, pointing out that he'd willingly participated in that corruption for money. Both perspectives were true. Ethan had learned to live with that contradiction. What mattered more was the impact on Clara's case. David Chen called the following Monday with an update. Allied Interstate has agreed to a settlement conference, he told Ethan. They know the criminal charges make their position in Clara's civil suit untenable. We're meeting next week to discuss terms. That's good, right? It's very good. We're in a much stronger negotiating position now than we were 8 years ago. Clara should receive compensation that's actually proportional to the harm she suffered. Chen paused. She wanted me to thank you. Your testimony before the grand jury was apparently very compelling. Ethan felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't expected. I just told the truth. Yes, but that took courage, especially given what you had to admit about yourself. Don't minimize that. After hanging up, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, thinking about courage. He'd never considered himself particularly brave. He'd spent most of his adult life making the safest, smallest choices possible, working reliable jobs, avoiding conflict, keeping his head down. The idea that facing the consequences of his own mistakes might constitute courage felt strange, but maybe that was what courage really was. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do the right thing, despite being terrified of the consequences. Christmas came and went quietly. Ethan and Lily couldn't afford much. Gifts were small, dinner was simple. But they spent the day together, watching movies and playing board games, and it felt more peaceful than any holiday Ethan could remember in years. On Christmas night, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the dark apartment, thinking about the year that was ending. 12 months ago, he'd been living the same small, careful life he'd been living for years, working his shifts at Morrison's, helping Lily with homework, getting by on not quite enough money, and telling himself it was fine. Now everything had changed. His past had caught up with him. His mistakes were public knowledge. His future was uncertain in ways that terrified him, but he also felt more honest than he had in years, more whole, despite being broken open, more like someone who could look his daughter in the eye without shame. The settlement conference took place in early January at a downtown law office. Ethan wasn't present. He had no formal role in Clara's civil case, but David Chen called him afterward with the results. We reached an agreement, Chen said, and Ethan could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Allied Interstate is settling for $4.2 million. Ethan sat down hard in his chair at the pharmacy's back office. That's substantial. It's what Clara should have received 8 years ago, plus interest and additional damages for the company's fraudulent conduct. After legal fees and expenses, she'll net approximately $3 million. Chen paused. She'll be able to afford proper medical care, housing modifications, education if she wants to pursue it. She'll have security for the first time since the accident. I'm glad, Ethan said, and meant it. She deserves that and more. She asked me to pass along a message. She said to tell you that this doesn't make you even, but it does mean something that you helped make it possible. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement. It was, Ethan thought, exactly what Clara had promised, not redemption, but the truth. And the truth, while painful, was also clean in a way that lies never were. The criminal trial for Robert Mitchell and the Allied Interstate executives began in March. Ethan testified on a cold, wet Tuesday, walking into a courtroom that felt vastly different from the intimate grand jury room. There were lawyers in expensive suits, reporters in the gallery, and Mitchell himself sitting at the defense table looking older and smaller than Ethan remembered. Ethan took the stand and was sworn in. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Teresa Gonzalez, led him through his testimony methodically. What happened the night of the accident? What did you tell the police? When did Mitchell contact you? What exactly did he say? How much money did he give you? How did you change your statement? Ethan answered each question clearly, looking at the jury as he spoke. 12 faces, mostly neutral, occasionally showing flickers of reaction, surprise, disapproval, sympathy. The defense attorney's cross-examination was predictably aggressive. He suggested that Ethan's memory after 8 years might be unreliable. He pointed out that Ethan had waited until he was confronted to come forward. He implied that Ethan might be exaggerating Mitchell's role to minimize his own culpability. Isn't it true, Mr. Cole, that you made the choice to change your testimony, that no one forced you to take that money? Yes, Ethan said. That's completely true. I made the choice. I'm responsible for what I did. And isn't it convenient that you're now blaming Mr. Mitchell for a choice you made freely? I'm not blaming Mr. Mitchell for my choice. I'm testifying about what he did, offering me money to alter my statement. What I did with that offer was my decision, but the offer itself was witness tampering, and that's on him. The attorney tried a few more angles, but Ethan held firm. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility. He was simply telling the truth about what had happened and letting the jury decide what it meant. After 2 hours on the stand, he was excused. He walked out of the courthouse into the spring rain, feeling lighter than he had in months. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Mitchell and one of the executives. The other executive was acquitted on some charges but convicted on others. Sentencing came in May. Mitchell received 4 years in federal prison. The convicted executive received 2 years. Allied Interstate Trucking was fined $7 million and placed under federal oversight for 5 years. Ethan followed the news from his apartment, reading the articles on his phone while Lily did homework at the kitchen table. When the sentencing was announced, she looked up. How do you feel about it? Ethan considered the question. I feel like justice happened. Not perfectly, it never does, but substantially. The people who corrupted the system are facing consequences. Clara got compensation she deserves, and He paused, searching for the right words. I got to be part of making it right instead of part of making it wrong. Lily smiled. That's good, Dad. Yeah, Ethan agreed. It is. In June, 8 months after Clara had first spoken his name on that cold November morning, Ethan received a letter in the mail. Plain white envelope, his name written in careful handwriting he recognized from the note she'd sent months ago. He opened it sitting on his bed. Lily at school, the apartment quiet around him. The letter was a single page, handwritten on simple stationery. Ethan, the settlement money came through last week. I've paid off my medical debts, modified my apartment to be more accessible, and started making plans for the future. I'm enrolling in graduate school this fall to study arts administration. I'll never dance professionally again, but I can help create spaces where other people get to dance. That feels like enough. I wanted to tell you that I don't hate you anymore. I'm not sure I forgive you. Forgiveness is complicated, and I'm not ready to offer it yet. But I don't carry the anger I used to. You helped with that, by facing what you did instead of running from it. I've learned something important through all of this. People are not the worst thing they've ever done. They're also not absolved of it by changing later. We exist in the complicated space between those two truths, trying to be better than we were while acknowledging we can't undo the past. You can't give me back the years I lost or the career I'll never have. But you did give me something valuable. You gave me truth, and you helped me get justice. That doesn't make us even, but it does mean I can close this chapter and move forward without the weight of knowing the system failed me and no one cared. Thank you for that. I hope you and Lily are well. I hope you continue to be the person you became this year instead of the person you were 8 years ago. And I hope someday, when enough time has passed, you can forgive yourself the way I'm learning to release you. With complicated but genuine wishes for your future, Clara. Ethan read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. He sat there for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought him from that November morning to this June afternoon. He thought about the man he'd been at 24, desperate, scared, willing to compromise his integrity for money he needed. He thought about the man he'd been at 31, so focused on survival that he'd buried his own moral failures deep enough to forget them. And he thought about the man he was now, at 32, still struggling financially, but no longer hiding from the truth about himself. None of it had been easy. The consequences were still unfolding. He'd lost friends who couldn't reconcile his past actions with the person they'd thought he was. He'd gained a certain notoriety in Boston legal circles. His name would forever be associated with witness tampering in news archives and court records. But he'd also gained something more valuable: the ability to look his daughter in the eye without shame. The knowledge that when faced with a choice between protecting himself and doing the right thing, he'd chosen truth. The understanding that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes, but about facing them honestly and doing better going forward. That evening, Lily came home from school with news that she'd been accepted into a summer program for advanced students. It was free, sponsored by a local university, and would give her the chance to study creative writing with professional authors. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Ethan said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Dad." She pulled back, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think things worked out the way they were supposed to?" Ethan thought about the question. "I don't know if I believe in supposed to. I think things worked out the way they did because people made choices, some good, some terrible, and then had to live with the consequences. Clara made the choice to confront me. I made the choice to tell the truth. Other people made other choices, and all of it together created this outcome." "But are you glad about how it turned out?" "I'm glad I did the right thing, even though it was hard. I'm glad Clara got justice. I'm glad you got to see that people can change." Ethan paused. "But I'm not glad about the 8 years she suffered because of my choice. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. Both things are true. I'm glad I faced it, and I'm devastated that it happened in the first place." Lily nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Life is complicated like that, isn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart. It really is." That night, Ethan did something he'd been avoiding for months. He sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Clara. Not expecting a response, not asking for forgiveness, just wanting to put into words what her letter had meant to him. He told her he was glad she was pursuing graduate school, that helping others experience dance seemed like a beautiful way to honor what she'd lost while building something new. He told her that he understood she might never forgive him, and that he was working on accepting that. He told her that he hoped someday, years from now, she might think of him without pain, not with affection or friendship, but simply without the sharp edges of anger and betrayal. And he told her that she'd given him something invaluable by forcing him to face the truth about himself. That her willingness to confront him, to give him a choice rather than simply destroying him, had offered him a path toward becoming someone better. Someone his daughter could be proud of. Someone he could live with being. He sealed the letter and addressed it to her lawyer's office, knowing Chen would forward it. He wasn't sure if Clara would read it, but that wasn't the point. The point was saying what needed to be said, whether or not it was received. Summer arrived, warm and bright. Lily started her writing program and came home every day excited about what she'd learned. Ethan continued working at Morrison's, picking up extra shifts when he could to build up their savings. The warehouse job in Quincy had let him go when the news about his testimony broke, but Morrison had given him more hours to compensate. In August, on a humid Saturday afternoon, Ethan took Lily to the Boston Public Garden. They got ice cream from a vendor and sat on a bench watching tourists take photos with the swan boats. "Dad," Lily said, licking chocolate ice cream off her cone, "do you ever regret it? Coming forward, I mean, everything it cost us." Ethan thought about it honestly. They'd lost privacy, stability, the comfortable anonymity of being nobody in particular. He'd lost the warehouse job and some friendships. They'd faced judgment and criticism and the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing how the legal proceedings would ultimately affect him. "Sometimes," he admitted, "late at night, when I'm worried about money or thinking about everything that could still go wrong, I have moments where I wish I'd never helped Clara cross that street, that I'd taken a different route to work and avoided this whole thing." But then I remember what it felt like to lie to you about who I was, to pretend I was someone decent while knowing I'd done something terrible and buried it. That feeling, that weight of being fake, was worse than anything that's happened since I told the truth. He looked at his daughter. I'd rather struggle honestly than live comfortably as a lie. Lily leaned against his shoulder. I think that's the right answer. They sat there together as the afternoon faded into evening, watching the city move around them. Families with young children, couples walking hand in hand, elderly people feeding ducks, college students sprawled on the grass. All of them living their own complicated lives, carrying their own secrets and mistakes and moments of grace. Ethan thought about Clara somewhere in the city, probably preparing for graduate school, building a future that looked nothing like the one she'd planned, but was hers nonetheless. He thought about Mitchell in federal prison, facing the consequences of choices that had seemed so easy at the time. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by one accident on a March night 8 years ago, and how one moment of carelessness had rippled forward through time, affecting strangers in ways the truck driver probably never imagined. He thought about how fragile it all was, how one choice could destroy a life or save it, how the distance between doing the right thing and doing the expedient thing was sometimes just $3,000 and a moment of weakness. And he thought about second chances. Not the kind that erased the past or absolved you of responsibility, but the kind that let you become someone different going forward. The kind Clara had given him by confronting him instead of simply exposing him. The kind he was giving himself by choosing truth over comfort, accountability over denial. In September, Lily started 8th grade. She'd grown 3 inches over the summer and had started wearing her hair different, pulled back in a ponytail instead of loose around her face. She was changing, becoming someone new, and Ethan felt the bittersweet awareness that his time as the central figure in her life was slowly drawing to a close. But for now, she still came home every day and told him about her classes and her friends and her dreams. She still sat with him at the kitchen table doing homework while he prepared dinner. She still looked at him with love and trust, even though she now understood he was flawed and had made terrible mistakes. Maybe that was the real gift Clara had given him. Not absolution, but the chance to show his daughter that people could face their worst failures and choose to do better. That integrity wasn't about being perfect, but about being honest when you fell short. One evening in late September, almost a year after Clara had first spoken his name, Ethan was walking home from work when he saw her. She was coming out of a bookstore, a bag of purchases in her lap, wheeling herself down the sidewalk with the easy competence he'd come to recognize. They saw each other at the same moment. For a second, Ethan considered crossing the street, giving her space. But then Clara raised her hand in a small wave, and he walked over. "Hi," he said. "Hi." She looked well, not happy exactly, but settled, at peace with herself in a way he hadn't seen before. "How's school?" Ethan asked. "Challenging? Good. I start classes next week." She gestured to her bookstore bag. "Buying textbooks. Apparently they cost almost as much as tuition." Ethan smiled. Some things never change. They stood there for a moment, the late September evening cooling around them. Finally, Clara said, "I got your letter, the one you sent through David. You didn't have to respond. I wasn't expecting to—" "I know, but I wanted to tell you that I read it, and I appreciated it." She paused. "I'm not ready to be friends, Ethan. I may never be ready for that, but I don't hate you anymore, and I hope things work out for you and Lily." "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "That means a lot." "Take care of yourself," Clara said. Then she wheeled away down the sidewalk, disappearing into the evening crowd. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her go. Then he continued his walk home, thinking about endings and beginnings and the complicated space between them. When he got to the apartment, Lily was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out. She looked up as he came in. "You're smiling," she observed. "What happened?" "I saw Clara, just for a minute. She said she doesn't hate me anymore." Lily considered this. "Is that enough?" Ethan thought about the question, really thought about it. Was Clara's release from hatred enough to constitute forgiveness? Was it enough to balance the scales of what he'd done? "No," he said finally. "It's not enough to fix what I broke. but it's enough to let me keep trying to be better. And right now, that's all I can ask for." His daughter nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Then I'm glad you saw her." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the dark apartment thinking about the past year, about transformation and accountability, and the long, difficult work of becoming someone you could respect. He thought about the man who'd taken $3,000 to lie, and the man who'd spent 8 years burying that choice, and the man who'd finally faced it when confronted by the woman he'd hurt. None of those men were entirely who he was now. He contained all of them: the desperate 24-year-old, the willfully ignorant 31-year-old, and the accountable 32-year-old trying to do better. People weren't static. They changed, grew, failed, and tried again. They made terrible choices and then had to decide whether to hide from them or face them. They hurt others and had to live with that knowledge, finding ways to carry the weight of their mistakes while still moving forward. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Redemption suggested a return to innocence, and Ethan knew he could never be innocent again. He would always be someone who'd taken money to lie, who'd helped a corporation escape accountability for destroying a woman's life. But it was truth. And from truth, at least there was the possibility of growth, of becoming someone who, when faced with hard choices, would choose differently than he had before. Ethan stood up and went to the window, looking out at the city lights stretching into the distance. Somewhere out there, Clara was preparing for a new chapter of her life, one she'd built from the ruins of what had been taken from her. Somewhere, other people were carrying their own secrets, their own mistakes, their own moments of moral failure. And here he was, in a small apartment with his daughter sleeping behind a curtain, having faced the worst thing he'd ever done and survived the consequences. Not unscathed, not absolved, but honest, finally, about who he'd been and who he was trying to become. It wasn't redemption, but it was truth. And for all of them, for Ethan, for Clara, for Lily, growing up watching her father choose courage over comfort, that was enough. The morning routine had changed. Ethan no longer walked down Hammond Street on his way to work. He'd found a different route, giving Clara the space she deserved, not inserting himself into her life anymore. But sometimes, on weekends, he and Lily would walk through that neighborhood, and he'd pause at the corner where so much had unfolded. "You okay, Dad?" Lily would ask. "Yeah," he'd say, just remembering. Because that was the thing about truth. Once you faced it, you couldn't unface it. The knowledge of what he'd done, who he'd hurt, what it had cost would be with him forever. But so would the knowledge that he'd made a different choice when given the chance, that he'd chosen his daughter's respect over his own comfort, that he'd helped Clara get justice even when it meant exposing his own failures. Life moved forward. Winter came again, and then spring, and then another summer. Lily finished 8th grade and started high school. Ethan kept working at Morrison's, eventually being promoted to assistant manager. The news cycle moved on to other stories, and his name faded from public attention. But the change, the fundamental shift in who he was, remained. He was no longer someone running from his past. He was someone who'd faced it, absorbed the consequences, and kept going anyway. And on the days when the weight of what he'd done felt too heavy to carry, when the knowledge of Clara's stolen years threatened to crush him, Ethan would remember her words, "I don't hate you anymore." Not forgiveness, not friendship, but release. It was enough to let him keep trying, enough to let him keep being a father Lily could be proud of, enough to let him sleep at night, knowing that he'd chosen truth when it mattered most. In the end, that was all any of them could do: face their failures honestly, make what amends were possible, and try to be better tomorrow than they were yesterday. It wasn't redemption, but it was real. And real, Ethan had learned, was worth more than any comfortable lie.